Hello, everyone. I'm joined today by Caleb Jackson. He's been working on a book detailing some of the most significant medically documented miracles. He's been working on this book for the last 4 years, and it's coming out later this year. How are you doing, Caleb?
I'm doing good, Logan. Thanks for reaching out. Yeah, so as you said, I'm a hobbyist in this theology and sort of the study of all this is very interesting to me. I've written two other books. One was on the resurrection back in 2019. One was on problem of evil. In hindsight, although I still think those books are important for where I was at the time, I think I've moved on from as an author and improved. And so I kind of look back on both of those works as incomplete. And so I'm hoping that this work is sort of going to be the top to top off both of those in that sense.
Yeah,
This
well,
way. So
definitely.
yeah.
Having read one chapter of your book, I can say it's very well written. It's scholarly, but also concise, and it includes rigorous documentation. So I'm very excited about the book, and I can't wait to read it. And let me ask you, how did you become interested in the topic of miracles, and why did you decide to write this book?
Yeah, so I get asked that question a lot, and there's not one definitive answer. One answer is that when I finished the book on the resurrection, I had a short chapter at the end about miracles, and I had given two or three cases that was like, oh, miracles could still happen, so the resurrection's not implausible. But I think just as a personality, I've always been interested in the supernatural, and I love horror movies, like ghosts, anything that's like paranormal. I think is just fascinating. The idea that there's another world beyond ours that we can't see, who wouldn't be interested? So when you tie that with religion, I think it just makes for a good ensemble in that way. So all of that parapsychological stuff has always been fascinating to me, and I think miracles are the best documented version of that because you're taking methods which we're pretty used to. You're taking people who are sick with the disease. We know how to verify that. Taking people who are cured, we can verify that. We're using the same methods that you would use by any doctor that would be admissible in any court of law for cases like that happen all the time with insurance fraud or whatever. So yeah, I don't think we're trying to recreate anything new here, right? We're working with materials that we have, and so I think miracles are a good offset of that. And I think like us and others have said, I think miracles are a great way of sort of drawing parallels between what we see today versus what we see in the New Testament. As much as we may like to read what happens in the Bible, there's so much that's removed culturally that it's really hard to know what it looks like. So when you can find examples of people today who are still healed of blindness or paralysis or what have you, like they are in the Bible, it really gives you new perspective to think how it would have looked back in Jesus's day, and that gives it a new perspective. And I think the final reason for me personally is that I'm not someone who is overly spiritually in tuned. I have a lot of people who claim to have very strong subjective experiences of the Holy Spirit or what have you. And although I respect those, I think I'm more analytically minded and I doubt my own emotions and my own processes. So religious experiences have always been interesting because I think I don't have the profound ones of that. So religious experiences that happen in a way that are verifiable, that don't just happen internally, but happen with physical consequences that you can prove, like tumors going away or bones being healed or what have you is very was very uplifting to me, and I think gave me a lot of hope for my own doubts on my own kind of religious experiences that those could be purely psychological. Now we have examples of things that I think you can show are not purely psychological, so that gives you more warrant, I think, within the more subjective kind of experiences that we can't immediately verify, but we have good analogies to. So all of those have been very impactful. I'll also say, just as a side note, I didn't know this at the time when I started, but I did find this out a few years ago as I was going into the book that my grandmother, when she was very young, had an incident to where she was getting her tonsils removed, and I guess something had happened when they got back to where it wasn't stitched up right, and so she started bleeding profusely from mouth, and a lot of people thought she was going to die. And she claims that as she was dying, this was recounted by my great aunt, who was there as a witness, about 7 or 8 at the time, that my grandmother claimed that she could see Jesus by her bedside in like a vision almost, and suddenly the bleeding stopped for whatever reason, no one knows why, and she attributed that obviously to a miracle. Now, I have no way of verifying that. Both of my relatives have since passed on, and this happened many years ago when they were kids, so memory is not always the most reliable. But regardless of whether or not the details are right, it did stick with me because had my grandmother not survived that, I wouldn't be here. And I know that's a cliche thing to say, but so the idea that a miracle may have been involved in my own existence, or at least could have played at that, I think adds on to the intrigue. So for all those reasons, the topic of miracles has just consumed me for the past several years.
Wow, that's fascinating. It is interesting how among a lot of the miracles that I researched, so many of them have factors that are similar to completely separate miracles. Like you said, either seeing Jesus or having a dream about Jesus or hearing the voice of Jesus. A lot of the miracles are tied to these types of experiences, which is interesting since these miracles are happening all across the world and are medically documented. So they're not just making up that the miracle happened. So yeah, that's very fascinating. Thank you for sharing. But before we get into some specific cases of miracles, can you start off by defining exactly what you mean when you say the word miracle?
Of course, and I have a few slides. I guess we'll go ahead and get started the presentation
Yeah,
on that. Let me know if
awesome.
you can see. Can you see that?
Yes.
So my first slide is about like what is a miracle. So I'm taking the definition that Robert Larmer uses. He's a philosopher, wrote for Oxford on the very subject, and he says that a miracle needs to violate the normal regularities of nature, be irregular, something that you don't see every day. It's uncommon. It needs to be directly caused by God or a supernatural agent at least, and it's done for the purposes of conveying a message. So you can have some, but not the other. So you could have an irregularity. Suppose that we were to observe, a fish fall from the sky, right? Now, maybe it was sucked up in a tornado and fell, or whatever. That's strange. But the purpose is by itself, that's weird. But we wouldn't make anything from that. I have no reason to think that God would just make a fish to drop just to mess with people, right? At least not a all good God in that sense. On the other hand, God could conceivably violate natural regularities and us not know about it. So suppose that you're about to get in your car and it turns out that the engine was messed up in a way where it would have combusted or broken and you would have gotten injured or killed had you driven in it. But God miraculously intervened and had the metal mend in a way that wouldn't have been otherwise physically possible without his intervention, right? That would be a violation of natural regularity, but no one knew about it. It happened, you were none the wiser. God saved your life and you had no way of knowing that. That would also not qualify under this definition. It would still be a violation of nature, but not under that definition. So the Latin word miracle, it literally comes from miraculum, which is to wonder. It's a wonder, it's a sign. So it needs to be something that is clearly displaying a message and done for a purpose to get your attention. And the way that it gets your attention is that it stands out from normal nature. If it didn't stand out, then you wouldn't be able to distinguish it from regular things happening. We've all prayed for parking spots before, I'm sure, and sometimes we may or may have gotten them, but that's not abnormal enough to be a miracle, because obviously people can find parking spots without praying for them. So we really want to look for things that seem very unlikely and probably wouldn't have happened otherwise had they not been invoked with prayer, and that when they happen, it's done for some kind of theological reasons, right? Where it's in a theological context. It doesn't just happen randomly. So, uh,
Fascinating.
yeah, and the philosopher David Hume, I'm sure as you know, wrote a famous essay on miracles where he describes these as a violation of natural law, and that definition is very controversial. Hume also had a sort of an outdated understanding of natural laws, like from Newton and stuff, where natural laws are these actual set fixed things that can't be changed, and they cause things to happen. Now we know that natural laws are just descriptive; they're not prescriptive. We just observe things and say this happens every time we observe it, so we're going to assume this is the law, right? But it's not like the speed of light sees the speed limit. It has to slow down or anything like that. We're just describing it. So Hume thought that we couldn't be justified in believing in miracles because you and I have experience of the world being consistent, having natural laws, and the vast majority of people don't observe these being violated. And so if someone testifies that they saw something that appears to violate it, well, we know that people can lie all the time, especially in religious contexts where there's motivation to lie. We also know people can be very gullible and sincerely be wrong, where they might want to believe something is true. And so they'll ascribe it to be a miracle when it may be not. We know that there's a history of science where we've discovered things that we thought were supernatural and turned out that they were natural, like lightning. They thought Thor was throwing thunderbolts. So that was sort of Hume's critique, and one that you see in popular post-Enlightenment scholarship. And a lot of people have critiqued that. I don't go too much into Hume in my own book, or will go into it here, because there's been plenty of people who've discussed this. Again, Robert Larmer is a good one to consult. I would also recommend John Earman's book from 2000. I think it was published by Oxford University Press, if I'm not mistaken, called Hume's Abject Failure. And Ehrman is an agnostic philosopher. He doesn't even believe in God. But he was like, although I don't believe in God, I don't think this is a good argument at all. It's very circular, because Hume is saying we can't believe in miracles because people don't experience them every day, even though he's excluding people who have experienced them every day, right? And is saying that we have to go by what we have in a common experience. But Hume didn't understand that natural laws are only based on closed systems. They're not based on open systems.
Yeah.
If you throw a ball in the air, gravity says that it's going to have to come down. But if someone catches it, you haven't violated natural law because the law doesn't have the contingency of, unless acted upon by another force. So if God comes in and intervenes, he's not really breaking a law. And you can't say in the same way that like a virgin could never give birth because you could artificially inseminate, or someone could never walk on water because you could freeze it. There's always these caveats. So we could say, yes, no one rises from the dead unless God intervenes to rise from the dead. But at that point, it would just be begging the question to say that God didn't do it in this case. And Hume is inconsistent because he'll talk about how we shouldn't believe testimony from religious people because they're uneducated and credulous. Now, he's writing in the 1700s at a time when he used the word barbarians and savages to describe essentially non-white people. He was very racist, unfortunately. But even within Europe, he cites examples like a famous case with Blaise Pascal's niece, and he cites a famous case from Spain involving an amputee getting a leg back. And in that case, there were about 24 witnesses who signed affidavits, including doctors who cut the leg off, saying, yes, I knew this guy for years. I did this. His leg was cut off, all that stuff. And Hume says, we have so much testimony for this. It's actually incredible. And yet we know this couldn't have happened. In fact, we know that we don't even need to look into this. It's not even worth researching at all because we know that the probability of everyone being wrong or lying is higher than the laws of nature being violated. But Hume was just taking a purely frequentist view of probability that's, again, very outdated to say, well, we just count the number of times people have been wrong or lying and count the number of times we've verified a miracle. And every time you do that, you're never going to get the miracle is going to win out, right? But by that metric, you could never verify any unlikely thing by testimony. There have been people who've won the lottery 4 times. That's highly unlikely. And you could say, well, what's more likely, that this newspaper is lying or mistaken, or that someone really won the lottery 4 times? Well, if that newspaper has a very strong reputation and journalistic integrity and all the other stuff, and it's backed by their sources, then that would be enough to verify that someone won the lottery 4 times, which is very unlikely to happen. We wouldn't just dismiss it based off of that testimony. So sufficient testimony under that conditions, I think, absolutely could be evidence of a miracle. And so when we're looking at cases like the ones in here where we have pretty good sometimes we have even pictures, right, of tumors or whatever, good medical documentation of before and after, and we have trained doctors who see these things, we should have reason to believe it. Obviously, doctors can be mistaken. This isn't to say that medicine's perfect, but certainly having it under these conditions is more rigorous and less likely to be flawed than maybe just your average eyewitness who sees something. So that's the general way that we should view miracles and testimony.
So, when you say that a miracle has to be done for the purposes of conveying a message, are you saying that there are never instances where a miracle happens just for the sake of the miracle? Like, for example, if somebody's healed just for the sake of healing them, are you saying that that wouldn't count as a miracle because maybe there's no extra message involved?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I would say that if someone is praying to be healed and they are healed, that counts as the message because God is answering their prayers. God is saying, like, I'm being faithful, I'm being engaged in our relationship, I'm staying with you, I'm healing you, I'm relieving you of your sufferings, right? That was certainly the message of Jesus, and I think one that you could convey theologically. But I think if it's just where God is looking down and saying, I feel bad for this person suffering, let me go and help them, and that's it. I think there's other reasons with theodicy about, why doesn't God just do that for everyone, right? Or and it would also, I think, deprive us as humans to be able to help people. If we expected God to just step down every time and help people, then we would stop helping people. And obviously that's not a good thing. So I don't think God regularly does this just because he feels bad for the person. I think he'll do this explicitly in a miraculous way to convey the message that he loves them or that they believe their prayers have been answered. Now, I'm not saying that God can't heal people through natural means. Maybe God makes a cancer gradually go into remission with chemotherapy. And maybe he did. I'm not here to say that God isn't healing people otherwise. I'm just saying that wouldn't be a miracle. You could say that's providential. You could say God is using natural laws. It just doesn't fall under that specific definition because you can't really determine whether that was God doing it or whether it was just natural law. I mean, like maybe God was doing it through natural law, but it's unfalsifiable. So that's an interesting question, but I think empirically we wouldn't be able to prove that other kind of example. So that's why the religious context is so important for it to be a miracle, if that makes sense.
That makes sense. So, um, let me ask you, do you think that by invoking God as part of your definition of a miracle, do you think this makes it easier or harder when a believer is debating a miracle skeptic if they include the idea of God in their definition of a miracle, does it make it harder for them to prove that a miracle has happened, or easier?
Mm. Yeah, so you could say, is it a circular definition where you're assuming God is the cause when we could say we don't know, right? And
Mm.
that's a good point where the miracle would be the idea that it was a miracle is the conclusion, it's not the premise. The way
Mhm.
that you get to it is say, well, in fact, I think I actually have this on the next slide. So the definition of miracle, it needs to be something that occurs within a religious context, and it's unlike events with a known natural cause. So we take those two principles, happen in a religious context, doesn't resemble natural laws we know of, and we infer from that to the conclusion that this was caused by something outside of natural laws that has religious dispositions. And so I have in the book a whole section on comparing theories because people would say, well, we can't just do God of the gaps, right? And I agree. We're not just saying we don't know what happened, therefore it's a miracle, or therefore God did it. I think that's fallacious. But to say, okay, this doesn't look like anything that was caused naturally. We can't repeat it in natural context, and it happened right after prayer, and it was very unlikely to happen. Those things put together, we can say, okay, I would predict that if God was doing these things, you would predict that it would have to happen in a religious context because of the prior definition, and that it would not resemble natural events. Because again, if God does it in a way that resembles natural events, you can't tell it's God. It could just be coincidence or something. So I predict that if God's doing this, it's going to have those two features. If you don't think God's doing this, then the other two are very just coincidental, right? There's no reason why a natural cause should only work under people praying for it or something like that, right? Like this is why that's important. If you could find something that happens broadly, um, cases of diseases that get healed without prayer, then I think that would not be a good candidate for a miracle. But if the only time this ever goes away is right when it was prayed for, I mean, there might be some natural law that does that, but that seems like a very ad hoc theory to say, well, okay, I'm going to propose a natural law that only works when you're invoking religion. Like that doesn't really make any sense nor to be plausible.
Mhm.
So it wouldn't
Yeah.
be it wouldn't be a good explanation compared to the perfectly viable explanation I would see that if you think that if you think God exists, or at least think the existence of God isn't remarkably low, that it's plausible that a God exists, then I think you could invoke him as an explanation in these kinds of cases, not just because you don't know what the cause is, but because that theory better predicts the data than the alternative.
Before we jump into some specific cases of medically documented miracles, can you kind of walk me through what criteria you use for determining that a miracle has happened, and kind of explain why you use these specific criteria?
Yeah, so I have a modified version of what's usually called the Lambertini criteria. It's named after, I think it was Prospero Lambertini, who was in the 1700s. He was a cardinal. He actually eventually became Pope Benedict the 14th. But he was the one who sort of paved the way for the criteria that the Catholic Church used for canonizing saints, and we'll get to that later on. But these are the criteria that they use. I think it's 7 criteria they have. I have 10, so I split some of them up and remodified a few of them. So I have it with an acronym MOPS Rupix, which isn't the easiest thing to remember, but that's the closest one I could find to have all these in there in the same order. So MOPS Rupix. So I would say that the ailment, although both technically have been, the ailment needs to be medically documented, right? So I'm not saying that we don't trust eyewitness testimony, but sometimes people don't always represent their condition accurately. I know of cases where someone said that they were healed of melanoma, and when you actually read the doctor's report, they'd had melanoma previously and they thought it came back, but the doctor said, no, it's just like a mark. It's not melanoma. And so when the mark went away, when they went to a prayer service, they said, oh, God healed me of my cancer that came back. So sometimes you need to make sure that what was recorded in the documents is actually consistent with what the person describes, right? So that's why I think medical documentation is important. It needs to be organic. So something that's not psychosomatic. The brain sometimes can cause, or the mind rather, people can think that they're sick when they're not. So heart aches, stomach aches, even paralysis and blindness, sometimes can be caused by stress and by hysteria in certain ways. So just because someone like lost feeling in their leg, well, what was the cause of that? Did they have nerve damage? Did they break a bone? We need to find that out first, because if we can't find a cause and it's something that's like that, it could be purely in the head. And if it's purely in the head, you can influence it through suggestion and placebo effects. So that could explain the recovery without invoking a miracle. So we want things that are organic. It's a tumor, it's a broken bone, it's nerve damage, something that we can verify is in the body in that way. It needs to be progressive. This one is also very important because it's a disease that was not getting better. In fact, it was getting worse over time. those are very unlikely to get better over time, especially if it's a serious disease. If you have a disease where someone had a condition and then you apply treatment and it's only resisted treatment and it's gotten worse, especially if it's like a neurological condition, someone loses feeling in their hand, then it's the arm, then it's the legs, then they go completely blind and they are eventually completely paraplegic. That's very unlikely just to get better because the body's losing that battle and fighting the disease. Progressive diseases are very serious. And if someone was obviously getting better before they were prayed for, you could say, well, the body was already starting the process, so we can't know that the prayer is what caused that. So if you have a progressive disease, that's less likely to go away naturally. Same with a serious disease, right? So people who have headaches, people who have backaches, like, I mean, those might be influenced psychologically. It's kind of harder to judge the speed of the healing than the nature of it. So something that's really serious, and I define serious as either it's life threatening, where their health is at immediate risk, or it's significantly disabling. And that would include that they would have to be on some kind of medication. They have to have some kind of aid, like a wheelchair, glasses, something where they could not function without this. And that's helpful because you can verify when they're healed by getting rid of that. If someone like could not see without a prescription, and then you take they're prayed for, and you take the prescription away, and they can see now. Well, that's sort of a cut and dry, like, oh, they can do something they couldn't before. Whereas if it's like, well, I had back pain and it was kind of hard for me to lift my arms up, and now I can lift my arms up. It's like, well, are you sure you couldn't do that before? It's kind of it's not as clear, right? There needs to be something that's very disabling or life threatening. So that's the criteria for the disease. When you look at the cure, there are six criteria I have, which is it's something that's religiously correlated, which just means it happens in religious context. So it happens when they were prayed for, they go to a religious shrine, a worship service, something that's clearly adjacent to a religious ceremony. That one's pretty obvious for the reasons we said before. It's unprecedented, which means that you don't have an array of examples where this happens outside of religion, right? So spontaneous remission of cancer is an example where there are some cancers where they will go away on their own and we don't always know why. And although we don't always know why, we're not going to just invoke God because we acknowledge that this can sometimes happen without prayer, right? So if this is something that only gets better when the only cases where this has ever been documented getting better are ones where there was prayer or some religious context, it's a lot harder to write that off and to explain that because you would not expect that from a natural cure. It's permanent. They don't go into relapse. That's pretty obvious. How long you wait to determine is a little bit difficult. I think typically the standard's like 10 to 15 years, depending on what the disease is. But obviously, the longer you wait and the longer it doesn't come back, the more confident you are. Whereas if it relapses, not to say that God couldn't heal someone and it could relapse, but it seems like that's more likely to be caused by something natural than it would be from God just letting them get sick again, right? Instantaneous. This one's also very important. It also helps you connect to the religious context. It's not as if someone's prayed for and then 5 months later they eventually get better, right? The human body is a whole process with the immune system. When you have tissues and bones that are built up, you have to have cells reproduce. You have to have your immune system is based off of cell reproduction. We know very well how cells reproduce, the rate at which they reproduce, all this stuff. So we know that a tumor can't shrink overnight. We know that a bone that's severely broken can't heal within a few hours. You have to have a very gradual process to repair it. Just like you can't build an entire building in one night. It's a gradual construction project. That's what your body essentially is doing when it's healing, right? So if this happens instantaneously, it's very hard to explain that through natural processes that we know of because the entire model that we know of the human body is based on this gradual cell growth. So if it's an instantaneous healing from a serious disease, we can connect that with the prayer if it happens right when the prayer happens and they get better. And we can also say that it's very unlikely to be a natural cause because it wouldn't happen that way. Now, I will say that there is a difference between this would include instantaneous remission of symptoms. So it is possible that if someone say has a cancer in their pelvis and that they cannot walk and it's very debilitating and they're prayed for and they immediately can get up and walk without pain and they feel better and the cancer is still, when you do the scans, it's gradually shrinking over several months, that would still count as instantaneous because the person was healed instantaneously, even if the actual organic disease took longer to go away, right? That's really what's important, is that the symptoms go away immediately more so than the actual disease. And of course, that could be partially psychological, but if this is with all the other criteria, it's permanent, all the other stuff, it's harder to write off. Complete, again, relatively straightforward. If they just get a little bit better, that could be natural. It could be the body repairing itself, but the body often repairs itself imperfectly. So for someone to be completely healed, I would say that that means they're no longer debilitated. Now, they still might have scars left over. They might have a slight limp, but nothing that would make it serious at that point. They don't need any more medications. They don't need any more aids in that way. And then the last condition and last criteria would be spontaneous, which means that they weren't receiving treatment that you could attribute to it. So if someone was on medication or chemotherapy and it goes away, maybe that's what caused it. We don't necessarily have to vote God in that case, right? Now, if they were on treatment and the treatment was clearly not working and they were only getting worse and that every treatment was discontinued, then that would be good. It would prove that it was a serious progressive disease. Spontaneous would also include people who are getting, for example, an infection that can cause cancer remission as well. Or if someone hit their head, they were paralyzed, they hit their head, and then when they woke up, they can move again. Maybe the hitting their head is what caused their nerves to go back into action or something like that. So spontaneous means that neither treatment nor an event immediately preceding it, besides the prayer, could have like realistically caused them to get better. So I know that's a lot. Do you agree with all those criteria? Are there any that you would dispute or think that like could be done another way, or do you think those are pretty
Well, yeah, I
straightforward?
was just going to clarify that you're not saying that if an event does not meet all of these criteria, you're not saying it's not miraculous. You're just saying that it's harder to prove it's miraculous. Is that right?
Yeah, it's not my job to say that God did or didn't heal anyone. So someone
Mhm.
might have a gradual remission from cancer with chemotherapy. That's great for them, and maybe God was involved in that. But from a purely empirical standpoint, it's a lot harder to prove that. So I would say with each of these that we can check off, the more my confidence goes up. So you might have one that only has 8 of these criteria. It could still be remarkable and still be inexplicable. But if you get 9 or 10, I think that's going to be even harder to explain than the other ones. So this is just based off of how different is God going to make it. The reason we have these criteria is because we're taking what do we know about natural healings and just doing the opposite of that to say if God's going to make this stand out from nature, we're going to make it as unlike nature as possible. And that's what these are meant to do. So the more you have on there, the more confident we would be.
Fascinating. Awesome. Well, now that we have covered these criteria, can you give me an idea of the range of miracles that you're going to be covering in your book? And then you can go into some specific cases that you find compelling.
Yeah, so I primarily break up the book with different cases about the kinds of ailments. So there's healings from blindness, paralysis, healings of children, healings following visions. And then you have healings that are in Catholic context, healings that are in Pentecostal context, and everything in between. So it's pretty wide variety. I try not to just stick with one kind. So you have a pretty wide range from gastrointestinal diseases to blindness to nervous diseases to genetic diseases. So I think having a big array encompasses the idea that we're not just invoking like one unknown explanation here, right? We're saying the fact that all these healings have these properties, these criteria, and yet we're talking about a very wide range of different elements that involve different parts of the body. It seems less likely that we can say it's just some unknown natural law, because it would be weird to think that this unknown natural law can affect all these different kinds of families of diseases in these same ways, right? So I think that variety helps the idea that there's an underlying cause of, that's theistic, that's an agent that has the ability to heal all of these, and it's not just something that's one-sided.
That makes sense. Yeah. Great. Well, awesome. Let's go ahead and jump into some specific cases.
Yeah, so we'll start with the Protestant healing. So obviously within Protestantism, the most dramatic and most like well-known would be the Pentecostal healing. So here's just a brief collection of books where there is medical documentation cited all the way from 1970 to 2021. It was funny because in the early ages of Pentecostalism, which was like about 1900, there were plenty of healing claims, but a lot of the people, a lot of the pastors were very hesitant to invoke medical documentation because they thought it was testing God. Well, you just aren't showing enough faith if you have to prove it, right? But after World War II, as you started getting more comprehensive with medicine, the tide changed where you had people like Oral Roberts and especially Catherine Kuhlman saying, hey, actually, it's a good idea if we start documenting these. This could be good evangelistically. People are more likely to believe it and we get a lot more national attention. So Catherine Kuhlman was really one of the first people to really emphasize having to get medical documentation for people who came on to testify that they were healed by her. So two of the books here, the first two on here by Alan Spraggett and by Richard Kasdorf, which I know that you mentioned in your miracles video, and I have a copy of right here, right? Go into great detail on some of her cases and like have pretty interesting documentation of some of them. And that's what really makes it compelling. Like here's a girl who had pelvic cancer who was cured at a Catherine Coleman conference is one example. So Kasdorf does have images of the original documentation. And so following that, you have other examples. I'm not going to go through all of these, but I'm not here to say that all of these are equally credible. Like one of these is a Benny Hinn book, and I think he's very controversial, and I'm not going to say every healing he's ever done is legitimate. But the point is, each of these, when they cite documentation, I think it does add to the reputability of them to some degree. So I would definitely recommend people do that. And this includes even ones like the second to last one at the bottom, is actually a book in Swedish by Michael Granholm, who I've talked to a few times. Who he did this in Sweden because there wasn't really an analogous one there, and he got lots of cases in Europe. So pretty wide range of time periods and of geographical locations for Pentecostal healing. So when we're looking at these, I really wanted to sort of try to draw parallels to the biblical accounts and to what we see today, because as much as we might believe in the Bible as Christians, obviously we're very limited in the way that we can look at ancient history. So I think finding analogies to say, hey, look, something like this can happen today. It's not as implausible to think that people were reporting this back in that day. And if miracles happen today, then surely they happened back then when people knew less about the world, right? So each of these, I'm going to try to find a parallel, and I'm going to mostly focus on Mark's gospel because it's the earliest one, and all the other ones are repeats. So in Mark 2, Jesus heals a crippled man where people bring him down from the roof. Very interesting story, right? And he hadn't been able to walk in years, presumably, and Jesus tells him to get up his mat and walk, and he's able to do it. And that astonishes the crowd. So one analogy I think to this would be Bill Kent. Now, Bill had been paralyzed after an accident that happened in May of 1985, a motorcycle accident, where he was riding and he got hit by a train coming on. I guess he didn't see it coming. And he ended up getting horrible neurological damage from this. So he was blinded in his right eye. He lost almost all feeling in his legs. He had a spinal cord damage. He had a closed head injury, and he lost most of the feeling on the right side of his body and his right hand. He could move his left hand a little bit. He had limited use of his right hand, no use of the other hand. So he was considered horribly disabled. In fact, you can see pictured there, obviously, he has the eye patch, he's in a wheelchair, and I don't know how well you can see it in this photo, but he has a Dalmatian next to him. That's his guide dog, Baron. He would have a service dog to help him with that. So the reason that I like Bill's case is because his history of being a disabled man is very well documented prior to his healing. So after he got injured, he ended up becoming a Paralympian, right, in the Paralympics. So he participated in the Paralympics, which is the Olympics for disabled people. So he was a professional rifleman. He would do shooting when they throw stuff in the air, and they'd have to do it for target practice. So he was very successful in this. He won gold multiple times. And this is very easily accessible. If you just Google his name and Google Paralympics, you can find the original records that have him admitted into it when he participated in the 1988 Seoul Paralympics. In fact, the Washington Post actually had a whole article where they were talking about it. It's like, oh yeah, Bill Clinton, who had been injured in a train accident years ago, takes home gold for the American team, right? So very well documented in mainstream media that this man was clearly disabled. He also was part of plenty of disabled groups. Like he was at one of the board of directors for National Wheelchair Shooting Federation and was on their public relations department. So his disability was very well documented. No one really disputed that this man was like clearly injured and was faking it for all of these years, right? So this is for 15 years he was doing this. Well, in the year 2000, he basically, after talking with people, gets the impression and feels very called by the Holy Spirit to go to World Harvest Church in Ohio. Now, he's originally from Pennsylvania, Maryland area, so that's a little bit of a drive, but he's able to get people to take him to there. So he goes to this service in November of 2000. And I don't know if you've ever heard of Rod Parsley before. He's, I think, a mega church pastor, but very big Pentecostal evangelist, and they believe in faith healing. So he goes there, and during the service, as Parsley's preaching, Bill Kent feels heat in his legs for the first time, which is unusual because he didn't have any nerve endings there, right? So an usher comes up and asks him what's wrong. And he's like, I think I'm about to get out of this chair. So he ends up getting out of the chair kind of stiffly, to his shock, and he says in his own words, this was the first time he'd ever stood up in 15 years, right? Because he had no use of his legs. So this was actually, the service was captured on video. So I do have a little bit of the actual footage here originally to show you that you might find interesting. So
we about plumb forgot about you. Sorry. How long have you been in that wheelchair?
Since 1985.
Since
Monday, the 13th of May, 1985 at 8:05 in the morning.
You got hit by a train?
Yes.
And you've been in that wheelchair ever since?
Yes.
Come here.
So yeah, so that's footage from the original event where he's able to get up. Obviously, he's walking a little bit stiffly because of the muscle atrophy. But 6 days after this, he would release a published testimonial where he testified to this. It says that he could now walk. He had full use of his legs and his hand. He still said that he couldn't see perfectly out of his right eye because of cataracts, but eventually that did go away on its own. And he would give quotations from his doctors. He, in particular, he cited Dr. Arthur Horn and Dr. Dino de Laportis, who both were amazed and had no explanation for how this happened. He also claims that he was on 39 different medications prior to this, and now he's on 0 in that way. So to my knowledge, I don't know if Bill Kinn has ever fully released his medical records. I do know that when he was on the Sid Roth show, was excerpted here, he did give Sid Roth some of the records, and Sid Roth would read excerpts of them. I don't know if those are fully available. He may have had it in the original testimonial, but I was able to follow up with how he's been doing since. And this is an article, if you look in the Record Herald and a local newspaper from 2009, so 9 years after his healing, that talks about this. He's now a fire chief with Blue Ridge Fire Department and Police Department. And you can see there he's clearly standing and walking. And in that article, they mentioned how he was paralyzed for 15 and a half years, and now he's able to work with them. He's no longer disabled. So this is one where clearly many years out, he stayed healed, doesn't seem to have any kind of relapse. And he clearly had a history of being significantly disabled prior to this. So that would be one example of a pretty incredible case of someone who was very paralyzed and very much had no prospect of recovery, who seems to have almost instantaneously regained function of his hand and legs again on video in a way that's clearly long lasting. So that would be one analogy we could draw to the healings of the New Testament. So what do you think about that, Logan?
Yeah, that's fascinating. I can't believe I haven't heard of this one before. But yeah, that's uh, unbelievable.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that. So another case, what about healing of terminally ill children, right? In the Gospel of Mark, we have the daughter of Jairus who's raised. Now, in Mark's Gospel, it said that she's raised from the dead, but the way that it's done, it's not clear if she had just died. So, was she completely dead? Was she dying? It's hard to know. But anyway, we have Jesus healing children who are in very critical condition, otherwise considered to be incurable, right? And I think we have analogies to that as well. So this is an example of Cameron and Caden Surs. And this one is particularly interesting because this involves two people being killed at the same time who are both brothers. So Cameron was born, and at 3 months of age, he starts having severe gastrointestinal issues. He keeps vomiting up food and can't keep it down. His brother, Caden, who was born 5 years afterwards, had similar symptoms. And so his parents suspected this might be genetic if they're both suffering from similar things. So for many years, this went undiagnosed and they weren't sure what the problem was. But eventually in August 2010, they go and they do blood testing. They eventually come up with it being glycogen storage and disease, which is kind of similar to like hypoglycemia or diabetes, where it has to do with blood sugar deficiencies. The body can't process this well, but it's much more rare and a lot harder to, there wasn't much known about this at the time, and there still really isn't that much. So they got that tested at the University of Iowa, and from the next 3 years, they would go down to the University of Florida, who had a very special program for studying GSD, and they were basically being tested under this. So normally GSD, it depends on the severity. It's not always life-threatening, but in their case, it was particularly dangerous. So both of the brothers were put on a strict diet where they had to have cornstarch every single day. And this is actual photo of what they would have to have. They'd have to have 90 grams of cornstarch a day, and they had to have their blood drawn 3 times every day. Similar to how diabetics have to have it, because they have to constantly monitor their blood sugar. Despite this, their prognosis was gradually getting worse. Oftentimes with the disease, in the more severe cases, you don't always live to adulthood. It usually ends in premature death. So they were Make-A-Wish kids, right? I think it was around 2011 is when they had a Make-A-Wish fundraiser where they ended up going to Disney World because they were considered terminally ill and not getting better. Unfortunately, their disease kept getting worse. By the time they get to about 2012, they have to up the gram intake to 165 a day because their blood is not being regulated. Cameron ends up suffering in August of 2013 from a severe liver damage. In fact, it's close to cirrhosis, which is equivalent to what almost severe alcoholics would have, where it's severe liver damage because the glycogen goes after this and can damage the liver and the spleen. So he needed a liver transplant, but they couldn't do it because his skeletal muscles were too weak. And so they were worried if they did the surgery, it could cause other problems. So he was too weak to have that. Cameron is the one on the right here, by the way, the older one. Caden had similar issues as well. Caden constantly suffered from severe abdominal pain. He would roll on the ground at least once a week and say that he wanted to die and was crying. It was really sad. And he eventually became so weak that they had to give him a feeding tube in October of 2013 because he really just couldn't stomach anything at this point. His body was rejecting it. So both of these boys were in very critical condition from a genetic disease that's otherwise incurable. And there wasn't much optimism they'd have much hope left. So their mother, being a very devout Pentecostal Christian, kept praying to God, and she kept saying that she had, the Holy Spirit telling her that she believed that they would be healed, right? So she takes them to this conference in January 2022 down in Illinois, and that's a picture of the church they went to. And there, the minister says that he had a word of faith that the Holy Spirit was telling him that these boys would be healed. He places their hand on them and prays for them. And at this moment, Cameron and Caden both said that they felt like the disease was leaving their body. They had a burst of energy and they got happy. And they said that when they got home, they could run around the stairs and had a lot of energy. When previously, they were horribly malnourished and fatigued and couldn't really do anything. They were constantly hospitalized. So a few days after this happened, when they were getting the blood tests back, the nurse for the first time said that the blood tests were normal. Cameron's at least was completely normal. Caden's was significantly improved. But both of the boys within the next 2 months gradually got off the cornstarch, where they started decreasing the amounts they got. And by March, they were completely off of it. And by March, both of their blood tests were almost perfectly normal, didn't have any signs of the disease whatsoever. Now, take in mind, this is a genetic condition, so this doesn't just go away. You could have symptoms go away occasionally, but typically not in this way. Now, Caden was, because he was younger and was very malnourished from the feeding tube, they did keep him on the feeding tube for a few more months just as a precaution, but he showed no relapse when they took him off the cornstarch. He gained strength again, gained weight, and by October of that year, they took the feeding tube out because he was doing well. And since then, this was 2014, from what I can see on their social media and the follow-ups that's been done 10, 11 years out, they are perfectly in good health and haven't had any issues since. So I think it's remarkable that we have here a genetic disease that is incurable, that at this point was clearly progressive and was very serious and life-threatening. Prognosis was not good, was not getting better. No treatments were working. And clearly they were having further complications as it went on. And despite the boys being 5 years apart, they both got better at the same time, right? When they were prayed for it, like within a few days. So even if this is some kind of unusual spontaneous remission, which seems unlikely given the course of the disease, the fact they both get better at the same time almost immediately seems very hard to explain as to how that could happen, right? It's not like they were hitting puberty or anything at the same time. So to me, that's a very interesting case where you have quite a lot of documentation in that way. So yeah, that's another one that I think is very fascinating for that reason.
Yeah, wow. The fact that they're both healed at the same time within the context of prayer, I haven't come across any miracles like that where multiple people are healed at the same time. So yeah, that's fascinating. Wow.
Yeah, and so far as I know, I think this is the only case I could find where it had involved a dual healing. So that's why it's one of the more particularly interesting ones. So
Wow.
what about healings from visions, right? In Acts, we have not exactly a healing, but we have Paul have the Damascus Road experience where he sees Jesus appear to him in a vision, and no one else around him can really see it, but he goes blind, so it has physical effects on him, right? We also have in Acts, I think it's in Acts 12, where Peter has a vision of an angel when he's in prison, and it says in Acts that he thought that he was just having a vision, but when he wakes up in the vision, he's outside the prison. It has like physical effects, right? So do we have examples of people having internal visions that end up having physical effects on the body, for example, like we see in Acts? And I think we do. So this is a little bit an older case. It involves Dorothy Karen. She was around 14 years old when she started having symptoms. Originally, she had a relapsing, remitting condition where it was believed to be tuberculosis, but there was debate. Some people thought it was just hysteria and psychosomatic, and some people thought it might be tuberculosis. But she felt extremely ill and fatigued. She kept going in and out of sanatoriums and hospitals, and no one could really figure out what's wrong with her. Sometimes she'd get better, but usually she'd get worse again within a few months. So by 1909, her condition got significantly worse. And at this point, she'd already been bedbound for like 2 years. But by 1909, she basically lost most of her mobility and was completely restricted to her bed or to being inside her house and moving around. But she didn't hardly go out in public at all. And she was considered to be pretty bad state by 1909, potentially terminal in hospice care. She's then overseen by a medical staff team for the next 2 years, where she gradually gets worse. She's coughing up blood constantly. Her stool has blood. So the diagnosis was that this was probably pulmonary tuberculosis, which is very common in the early 1900s. As you know, it causes the lungs to bleed. It's caused by a bacterial infection. And it was at that point untreatable. We didn't have antibiotics at that time. Nowadays, it wouldn't be that bad. But back in the early 1900s, progressive versions of tuberculosis were usually a death sentence. This especially got worse right after right after Christmas, when we get to December 26th. So by February 1912, sorry, by February, yeah, by January, she starts to lose sight and deafness, and she becomes deaf. And that might be because her tuberculosis expanded to meningitis, which is where the brain swells up and you lose nerve sensation. So at this point, she's completely bedbound. She can't eat at all. They can only they kept her alive by giving her I think it was like whiskey, water, and ice chips, but she could hardly intake any food at all. She was blind and deaf and was coughing up blood, horribly fatigued. On February 4th, she basically slips into a semi-comatose state where she's mostly unconscious, but is just murmuring some things, but is mostly unattentive. And she would sometimes say things like, "Wow, look at them. They're so beautiful." And her family wasn't really sure what she was talking about, but she would seem to be like at peace, essentially. And on February 14th, many witnesses actually witnessed that when she was saying these things, they according to eyewitness testimony that we have in affidavits, her face literally glowed up, almost like the transfiguration. It was radiating light. Maybe that was the reflection of the window. I don't know, but that's what was reported when she saw these things. But her condition, despite this, didn't get better. And by 9 o'clock on February 18th, she was basically believed to be dead. She didn't have a detectable pulse. She wasn't breathing at this point, and obviously she hadn't been getting better. Her doctors had, they didn't officially declare her dead, but they had said the night before that she's probably not going to live through the night because her condition's been worsening. Well, normally that's how the story would end, but strangely, that's not. About 30 minutes after that, Dorothy suddenly gets up and wakes up, sits up in her bed and says, and looks around, and her mom says, "Dorothy, can you see or hear me?" She's like, "Yes, Mom, I can see you again." So her eyesight's come back, and her ears come back. She can hear again. And she's like, "Mom, I feel better now." And her mom's like, "Dorothy, you need to get some rest. You don't need me getting up." And she's, I think, in her early 20s at this point, by the way. So she's waking up, and she insists that she wants to get out of bed. So she gets up and starts walking around. Now, take in mind, this woman's been basically bedbound, or at least in her house, for the last 5 years, and she hasn't eaten anything for like the past 2 months. Horribly, was fatigued, was dying for the past 2 weeks. So the fact that she immediately is able to get up and starts eating food and feels better, despite being basically dead, 30 minutes ago, is remarkable. And she says, "Mom, do you see the angel?" And her mom's like, "What are you talking about, honey?" And no one else in the room can see it, but she says that while she was unconscious for those 2 weeks, that she went to heaven and that she saw a field of angels, and she sees a light that she calls the Almighty, or the One. She thought it was Jesus, but the One instructed one of the angels to come to her and grab her hands. And according to her, the angel had basically lowered her back in her body. And that's when she woke up. So she says that she can see the angel in the room. No one else can see it. And she also can see her dead father, who had passed away a few years before that. And she was conversing with him. Again, no one else can see this, but she seems to be doing that. But we had about 16 witnesses present for either when she was dying, when she recovered, or both, who testified to this to say that they saw her get up. They knew her condition prior to that. These were friends, family, and neighbors who'd been by her side, and they were all astonished by this. So she goes and gets x-rays taken a few days after that, and they show no tuberculosis in the lungs at all, which is remarkable. This was reported, I think, 2 days after the fact. This is February 20th, 1912. You see the headline is "Girl who was blind and deaf recovers senses. Young woman at one time unable to walk claims that she is now in perfect health." And this was very widely publicized in Britain, where this happened, in the press. And so the press would come and they would interview her doctors. I'm not going to read off this whole thing here, but if your audience is curious, they can always pause it. But his doctor basically confirmed that, yes, we've been caring for her for the past several years. These last few weeks, she was dying, a horrible disease. We couldn't do anything for her. She was literally just on like water and brandy. And suddenly her family calls me the day after and says that she's completely healed. And I go and examine her, and I can't find anything wrong with her. And I have no explanation to this. We also have two witnesses, again, testimony here from affidavits, where they testify that, yes, I knew Dorothy. I was taking care of her. There was nothing that could be done for her. She was dying from a very severe illness. Suddenly she's able to get up and walk, which she hadn't been able to do for years. She's able to see again, completely healed. Dorothy would go on to actually become an Anglican minister, and she would live for another several decades without issue. Ironically, she would actually be healed of two other cases unrelated to this later in her life, but I only had time to focus on one. And so I think this one's particularly interesting because she would constantly claim to be having visions of Jesus or angels to her. And normally I would say that we can't verify that those could be hallucinations or something like that. It's hard to prove otherwise. But in this case, although normally I would be skeptical of someone claiming to see an angel when I can't see it, the fact that she immediately got better and was healed is really hard to explain. And so maybe her near-death experience being the cause of her sudden recovery, it's hard to write that off, because there really, I don't think, is a good medical explanation for how someone could be so sick from a continuously worsening disease for several years and then immediately within a few minutes be completely healed. So I think the fact that this happened within the context of her seeing angels and claiming that the angel cured her is really intriguing. So
Wow, fascinating. So, um, so the X-ray showed that tuberculosis was completely gone. Did they happen to have any X-rays before showing the tuberculosis, or was the diagnosis made just based on observing her symptoms, that kind of thing?
that's a great question. So it's funny you bring that up, because I was just reading that the other day. So there was a book written a year after this happened in 1913 called, I think it was called Hysteria and Spirituality or something like that. I forget it. And they were asking the question about this because they had reviewed her records, and there were X-rays done prior to the 1910, when she was in a really critical condition, when she was relapsing and remitting, and there was mixed opinions. Some of the doctors, apparently there was one test that did find the bacteria for tuberculosis, but other people disputed that. And there were some doctors prior to that who said she may have just had a psychosomatic issue that was hysteric. But it was agreed by her doctors by the time that she got really critical, from 1910 to 1912, that was certainly tuberculosis. And I don't think there were ever any diagnostic things done to confirm that. But with her condition that involved a fever, which I think was all the way up to 105, involved coughing up blood, in that sense, that's not something you're going to get psychosomatically. Back then, a lot more things were considered hysteria, especially if it was with women, because they didn't really have the same radiography we did, or at least it was, X-rays were pretty new back then.
Yeah.
So people thought that pretty much anything that women got was just hysteria. It was just them being too emotional. But nowadays we know that's not how that works. So when someone is coughing up blood, bleeding internally, her symptoms are certainly more consistent with tuberculosis than hysteria, right? Especially when she was unconscious most of it. I don't think a psychological suggestion is really going to be plausible. So the author of that 1913 book concludes to say, although it was debatable what she had before 1910, that could maybe be psychological. Certainly by the last 2 years of life, when she was in critical condition, it was, all of her doctors were pretty confident it was tuberculosis. In fact, the doctor who did the X-rays actually said that he didn't. He was a specialist in tuberculosis, and he said that he didn't think that she had tuberculosis, but he said the only reason I think that's because there's no way she could have recovered in the way she did. Like that it would be impossible for someone like that to recover that quickly from that serious disease. So it couldn't be that. Like, and so it's kind of putting the cart for the horse to say, well, it would be impossible for the otherwise, even though her other doctors agree that it was, and that her symptoms were not consistent with hysteria. So that's a good follow-up question. So it's one of those where sometimes, just given the limitations, you don't always have every test that you'd like to, but it seems obvious when you have someone who's dying, who's mostly unconscious, who's bleeding. Like, that's one where, even though medical technology back then is not the best, it's really hard to be mistaken that they're clearly in critical condition regardless, and it's hard to just write that off as purely psychological. Certainly no one with psychological illness is going to be that bad of a state.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. Wow, powerful. Thanks for sharing.
Of course. So now we've gotten past the Protestant healings, number of those. So now I want to go into some of the Roman Catholic ones. Again, just like I had before, here's a number of books I'd recommend. Some of these are by doctors who headed the Lourdes Medical Bureau, which we'll get into, or some of the Vatican miracles. In that way, these are all ones that typically have some summations or even photos of medical documentation. So another analogy, in John 5, we have the pool of Bethesda, which we've actually discovered since then archaeologically. But people would come to this pool in Israel and they would believe that they could be healed, right? I think in John it says that they think that an angel would come down and touch the water, and that's what would heal there. So you get the man who is paralyzed, who Jesus heals there.
Yeah,
But
funnily enough, actually, that statement in John 5:4 is a textual variant. So it wasn't in the original manuscript, in the oldest manuscripts of John, but it was likely a scribal note that was added to the side of the manuscript and then ended up being copied into the text. So where it actually says outright that it was a miracle that came down, an angel that came down and stirred the water, that is a textual addition. Just a fun little tidbit about that passage.
And I'm glad you pointed that out. I did know that, but certainly it was believed at the time that this was like Miracle Spring, right? People would go there to be healed.
Right.
Yes, of course. So we do have an analogy to this that you have with Lourdes, France, right? Lourdes is very well known as a miracle hotspot. In fact, it's probably the best example I think you could find of this kind of stuff. In the mid 1850s, you had a young girl named Bernadette Soulerieux who claimed to have visions of the Virgin Mary. No one else ever saw Mary, but they did say they saw her become transfigured and stuff like that. Anyway, she sees the Virgin Mary by this grotto, and the Virgin tells her to start digging. And when Bernadette does this, water pops up, and it ends up creating this big spring. People would come here, and a lot of them believed Bernadette was a real visionary, and so they would come and drink the water. One of the women came down, who was one of the neighbors, and she'd had her hand was paralyzed. I forget the position, but she'd fallen off of, I think it was like off of a tree or something, and had nerve damage, and couldn't move her fingers for the last 2 years in one of her hands. And she goes down, she tries to pray with Bernadette while Bernadette's having one of these visionary sessions, and her hand touches the water, and according to the witness testimony we have, the hand just like sparked back up for the first time. And soon word got out that this is miracle water, and that this stuff, the true miracles were happening here. So a few days after that, a man who had been blinded from an accident, a mining accident where shrapnel flew into his eye, came and put water on it, and he could he could apparently see, and his doctor confirmed this as well. So by the late 1850s, the church was wanting to investigate these and see if she was telling the truth. So they had a doctor come who was a professor of a medical school at the time, and he investigated dozens of these claims. And he said out of the dozens that he investigated, probably about 10-ish, he said, were medically inexplicable. And of those, the church verified 7 of them. They said, we're going to declare 7 of these as miraculous. That was in 1862. By 1883, you get the actual medical bureau established, where they're saying we're going to have a whole system to like investigate these things. Now, for the first 20 years, it was kind of rudimentary. They didn't really have strict criteria. They just sort of looked into these. By the early 1900s, in 1905, the Vatican officially stamped approval to say you can do these rigorously. You can use the Lambertini criteria that we normally use, and you can be documenting these things. So you get a lot of declared healings from here. So by 1954 is when you have this become the International Bureau, and this is the most standard iteration. So to give you an idea, Logan, of how this would normally work, right, in the current system, you would come to Lourdes if you were a sick pilgrim, and you would bring with you, you'd usually come in a pilgrimage group with a group of other people who set up by your diocese if you're Catholic, and you'd come with a big dossier of like your medical history with whatever it is that you have. And so if you were to go in the water and pray, and they say that you're cured, they would then go and you would go to the president of the medical bureau, his office, and you would hand him the dossier and explain to him, hey, this is my medical history, here's all this stuff, and now I feel better. And they would examine you, do all the tests they could do. And if they thought it was compelling, they'd say, okay, come back in a year and we'll see how you still are. If they didn't think it's compelling, they would just dismiss it then. So if you get past the first stage and they say, okay, this is interesting, come back in again, you come back a year later. Between this year is when the president of the medical bureau would get in contact with your doctors and would ask for follow-up questions, additional documentation, additional tests to be done, try to get clarification. And once you do that, you're brought back again the next year, and any doctor who's visiting Lourdes that day, which can be anyone, and there's a lot of them, would be called to a meeting if they want to come. And we would say, okay, here's this case file, here's the patient, here's the stuff we've done, here's what his primary doctor says. We're going to vote on this. Do you all think we should proceed with this, or do you think this can be explained naturally? The doctors there would vote. If it gets voted through, it moves on, and they do this 2 or 3 more times over the next few years. They would wait like, oh, wait 5 years. You'd come back, they do it again. If you get voted on every time where they say, yes, we think this is medically inexplicable, then it gets sent up to the International Bureau, which was created in the 1950s. The International Bureau is a bureau of 30 different doctors of specializations, and they would get it, and they would pick whichever doctor is specialized in it. So if it was a neurological disease, let's say it was multiple sclerosis, they would pick the neurologist of the group, and he would write up a long report where he summarizes all the documentation. And he can bring in specialists, he can bring in outside parties to peer review this and double check this and get their opinions. Once he's able to get all that stuff, he then presents this to the medical bureau. Then the medical bureau has to vote on whether they think this is medically inexplicable or not. If the medical bureau confirms that they think this is inexplicable by a vote, it gets sent to the diocese which you're from, and then your bishop has to approve this as a miracle. So the medical bureau does not actually say it's a miracle. They just say whether they think it's explicable or not. And that ultimately the church is the one who declares it as a miracle. So I say all that to say this is a very long and arduous process. Usually it takes many, many years, sometimes decades, to this whole thing to go through. So this is a highly peer-reviewed, highly critical way of looking at it that's more rigorous than what you're going to find in most medical journals. So there's been 72 cures as of this year. One of them was late last year. One of them was declared this year. So I had to update this. So it which have been certified. Now that's a pretty small number when you can think of the thousands of people that go there every single year. So of course, when you have a big group of people, some of them might get better naturally, just statistically. But this is why we have the criteria to not just say they just get better, but in a way that's completely inexplicable. So some
Yeah.
examples you see here,
But,
these are,
but before
oh,
you
go
jump
ahead.
into those, I want to say one quick thing about the miracles at Lourdes. You don't have to believe that the water is imbued with any sort of special or magical properties to believe that these miracles are authentic. Craig Keener, in his book on miracles, talks about lots of miracles that took place when people came in contact with Catholic relics, and
Right,
how we know historically that many of these relics are inauthentic. Like, for example, there might be the nail that was used to nail Jesus to the cross, but there are so many different nails in different churches that they can't all be the original nail from Jesus's cross. But then someone has an inexplicable healing when they come into contact with one of these relics. And Craig Keener explains in one of the footnotes of his book how sometimes relics, or in this case, the water at Lourdes, could serve as like a contact point of faith for the believer who goes there. So, because of their own beliefs and experiences in relationship with God, often reach a state of climax when they come to one of these sites that they consider to be holy, or come into contact with one of these things. It can lead to these types of experiences, or an abundance of faith that can result in a real miracle, but that you don't have to necessarily believe that the water itself is like the thing causing the miracle. You can still believe that it's part of the person's faith and their relationship with God, and God causing the miracle, to believe that these miracles are authentic. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that. I think that's a good point because in Acts you see people who are touched by Peter's shadow or they touched like a cloth or something, right?
Yeah.
And they're healed. And I don't think that it is sort of a very Catholic way of viewing it where they think that these things are literally impugned. That's why they have the bodies of saints. But I agree with you. I think my more Protestant leanings are to say that I think it's the faith of these people that ultimately matters, right? Even if you don't think it's the Virgin Mary healing them. A lot of these people are in very critical condition or very sick, and they're spending their life savings to travel pretty far when they're in bad condition to this place just for the hope of getting healed. So it's not just like, oh, let me say a quick prayer. These people are making a lot of sacrifices to come here, financial and physical, right? And you know how jet lag people get in general when they travel. Imagine being terminally sick and getting that, right? So it's a big step of faith for sure. And I think that's what's being rewarded here. I also forgot to put this. I actually have a vial of the Lourdes water. This is actually on Amazon, so you can get it pretty
Oh,
easily.
wow.
I haven't drunk it or anything like that, but I think it's a cool as a display. And they've done
Wow.
tests on the water, and there's nothing special about the water that would imply any kind of healing property. But so yeah, they've had 72 official cases as of now, and these are a few of the pictures I have here are some of the documentation they have at the Lourdes Museum you can go to. The one up here was about a broken leg that allegedly healed instantaneously. I've written a whole article about that if you're interested on academia. Pierre Dercruder was the name. It was Lourdes Miracle number 8. Allegedly, the bone was sticking out and went back in like that from witness testimony. The one up here is Vittorio Micheli, Lourdes Miracle number 63. He had pelvic cancer that was eating away to the point where he didn't even have a hip bone connecting his, like the joint of his leg of the tibia wasn't connected to the pelvis. It was just tissue, but the bones weren't touching it. So it was like hanging basically. And he goes to Lourdes on the stretcher because he can't walk. And he immediately feels better and is able to eat and is reinvigorated again. And within a month, the cast, comes off. The cast comes off and he's able to walk again with canes, and the cancer gradually goes away. Not only does the cancer go away, but the bone itself actually repairs the sarcoma, or the part of the pelvis. And apparently that doesn't really happen. Like that's one of the cases where say you have something growing back that really can't grow back naturally. And the last one on here is actually one of the second most recent one, John Trainer. That was declared back in December 2024. He was actually healed way back. I think it was 1923. So they waited over 100 years to declare it. But he was a World War I veteran who was disabled. He got shot in the head and the shoulder. He had epilepsy. He couldn't move his right arm at all, and he was completely paralyzed in both legs, or mostly paralyzed. And he comes to Lourdes, and after he goes in the bath the next day, he wakes up and he jumps out of his hotel room and he literally runs across to the grotto to thank the Virgin Mary. And the staff had to chase him because he was like, just to do that. And they couldn't even keep up with him. And this man hadn't walked in like 5 years. So, and he was also, catheterized on the other stuff. So he was completely healed other than like a slight like engraft in his hand, but was completely functional. And so those are some of the examples of like really surprising cures that happen that I don't think you could just ascribe to chance or to spontaneous remission. So one specific case I did, oh, sorry, we're going to go to the statistics first. So if you actually look, here are all the ones that we've had in terms of when they've been declared. So it's a common thing that for people to say, well, if you look at the chronology, isn't it convenient that they seem to decrease over time? The more precise our medical records get, the less miracles you have at Lourdes, right? Is it so, it could be misdiagnosis or something. And that's partially true, but it's also a little bit misleading. One is that they've actually started to increase for the past couple of years, but one of the biggest factors is that if you notice the time on the far right corner, the time of recognition has gotten much more steep. It used to be 4 years in the early 1800s, and it got to about 10 years. Now it's up to 30 years of how long they wait before they declare a miracle now. So that, I think, is the reason why this has slowed down the process so much, is because they take an enormous amount of time to do that. And frankly, a lot of people who are in the process end up dropping out because having to constantly go back there over the course of several decades, constantly having to go to the doctor to get this test done and that test done. A lot of people just say, you know what, I have faith. I know God healed me. I don't need you to declare it. And it's just not worth it. So most people don't actually end up lasting that long. So that's why it's a very arduous process. But for those who do, it's very rewarding. So I think this just shows how critical and how much peer review there is going into this. The third most recent case that was declared in 2018, ABC News did an interview with the Lourdes medical doctor there, and he talked about how she was healed of a kind of paralysis. And he says that I can assert with absolute confidence that her case was reviewed by 300 physicians, and that anyone who wants to come by can look at it. And so it's one of those where it's like, 300 physicians being all wrong seems very hard for me to take in terms of testimony. So pretty wild stuff. And if you're curious of the kinds that are healed, a large number of these, actually the most common thing that was healed was tuberculosis, and a lot of that comes from the early 1900s, late 1800s, and that was a very common disease. You also get a lot of neurological conditions, paralysis of different kinds, blindness. Then you have traumatic ones, and it goes down the way from that. So that's the statistics in terms of the most commonly cured things based off of that. So here's an example of Lourdes healing, right? In the Bible, we know an example where there's a woman who's bleeding for, I think it was 12 years, 10 years, a very long time. Doctors couldn't cure her. She comes up and touches Jesus, and apparently the bleeding stops. She's completely healed, right? So do we have examples where people have bleeding or suppuration, right, where it's like pus? For many years, that's incurable, where they're suddenly instantly healed in a way. Well, there's one example of that in Lourdes. Marie Borel, this was in the early 1900s. She had an appendectomy where they had to remove her appendix in 1923. That itself wasn't much of an issue. They were able to treat that. But a few months after that, her wound where they had surgically inserted it opens back up again as a fistula. Well, that's not good. So they have to go and they try to stitch it back up. It opens up again. They botch the surgery. Not only that, but it becomes infected, and she gets 2 more spots on her abdomen opening up in this way. And this becomes obviously extremely painful. It's seeking out pus constantly. She then grows worse over time as she gets infected. It's believed that she probably had gastrointestinal tuberculosis, although no tests were officially done to confirm that diagnosis. But obviously, even if the diagnosis is disputed, you can't really be wrong about someone having holes in their body that have pus and blood coming out constantly. That's pretty visibly obvious, right? She then gets 2 big ones in her back that open up as well that are seeping this out. So by about 1905, as we're going to this, she becomes mostly incontinent. She has to have a catheter. She can't have a normal bowel movement up until her last year. She's mostly bedbound and extremely weak from all this infection. It gets really gross, but her back wounds constantly have pus and blood coming out. She has bandages that are changed a few hours every day. And in her front, the wounds are so deep that they actually pierced her intestines slightly. So she had like fecal matter and stuff coming out of the wounds that they'd have to address. So again, very gross stuff and very nasty, but clearly indisputably sick, not something that someone could easily be mistaken about. And she had this from 1903, progressively getting worse all the way up to 1907. So for 4 years, that was considered untreatable. She then goes to Lourdes in 1907. She's brought on a stretcher because she can't walk. And after she's put in the bath, she instantly gets up and feels better, and she's able to walk. And she then has a normal bowel movement for the first time in several months and takes her catheter out and has no issues. And within, I think the first day, her 3 abdomen wounds on her front, which you can see at this top picture, stopped leaking pus and they closed up. So you can see where the indentions were. They instantly closed with, or at least over a few hours, with new tissue, new skin. So it wasn't like completely over it, but the actual opening closed up with a light new patch of skin. Then the back two, which are the bottom picture there, very deep wounds, those closed over with new tissue over the next day of that. So over a 48-hour period, she'd had these 5 large wounds that had been constantly secreting pus and matter and all that stuff for 4 years consistently, suddenly dried up, suddenly didn't have this anymore, suddenly closed with new tissue all within a few hours. They waited, I think, 4 years before they declared this a miracle, which they did. And she stayed healed for another almost 20 years after that. She died in 1921 from a different condition that had nothing to do with this one, but she never had a relapse. So it's a pretty remarkable case of someone who was suffering from very visibly obvious disease for many years, and was suddenly healed. I think that's kind of obvious, analogous to the bleeding woman. So do you have any thoughts on that?
No, that's just fascinating. Yeah, that's unbelievable. So, I'm curious, do you happen to know, like, uh, did those indents in her body, were those permanent? I'm guessing those
They
remain.
did eventually close over the next, I think, few years. They eventually scarred over completely. Yes.
Oh,
So
wow.
they didn't immediately scar over. They did immediately close up and dry
Yeah.
up, and with that, but yeah, the actual process. So she still had the scars left over that faded. So like as proof,
Wow.
but yeah, but her
That's
condition immediately improved, obviously. So that's one of those where it's like
yeah.
almost an amputee healing because you have something where it's like new skin being created
Yeah.
almost over like within a few minutes. That's very visibly obvious. So it's pretty remarkable.
That's wild. And you said she bathed, like was submerged in the water, Lawrence, is that right?
Yes, she did, but obviously that alone is not going to close the wounds, right? Like
Right,
she had to
right.
have her things. Yes, it's not like she hadn't taken a bath in that many years, like to be bathed. So she
Yeah.
had gotten the water, and that's when she felt invigorated and was able to stand up for the first time. She was
Wow.
lowered into it from the stretcher because she couldn't even walk. She was so weak, from
Wow.
that. So that's one. All right, so now let's talk about the canonization one. So we've moved on from Lourdes a little bit. So the Vatican, ever since the Protestant Reformation, when they had the Council of Trent, the Protestants were all like, y'all are gullible. You all have these really questionable saints who have these saint cults and don't have any kind of dogma. So the Catholic Church had to basically hit the hammer down and say, all right, guys, like no more just making people saints. We have to get more strict on who are leading into this, right? So they said that now we have to have miracles to verify that someone's a saint after the death. Doesn't even count if they were alive. Has to be when you pray to them. And it's interesting that they do this because they're almost treating it like it's a hypothesis. To say if this person's in heaven, which is what it means to be a saint in the Catholic Church, then they can intercede on your behalf. You could pray to them, they should be able to answer this, and the prayer should be obvious. So they sort of test this by saying if someone does a miracle in your name when you're dead, that means that you might be in heaven interceding on them. Um, the most common scholar who's done the most work on this is Jacqueline Duffin. She's pictured here, and her stories in her books here by Oxford University Press, again, high level book. And her story is fascinating because she is actually an atheist, and she still is an atheist. And she's the one who documents this. And she back in the 1970s, she's a medical historian and she's a hematologist by trade, blood doctor. She was brought slides that she didn't know where they were from, and someone said, "Hey, can you blind review this?" And so she looked at the slides, and it was a case of leukemia. Someone had leukemia cells; they got worse. It went away gradually, but then it relapsed. And at that time, a relapse of leukemia was a death sentence. It's like it can maybe get better, but once it comes back, okay, it's incurable. You're basically done for. And surprisingly, after the relapse, it went away again from the slide she was looking at. And she thought this was for some kind of lawsuit, that there was like some kind of issue, that misdiagnosis or something like that. So she hands this back to the person and says, is this a lawsuit or a miracle? And the person smiles and says, a miracle. And she's like, what do you mean? And then they explained to her that this was actually a canonization case for Canada's first saint candidate, Marguerite Duville. And they had actually wanted a third-party consultation. So the Vatican had asked her to review these blindly without telling what this was for, to get her medical opinion. And so she was fascinated by this. And so then the person said, well, can you come up to I don't think it was to the Vatican, it was to the diocese, to the bishop, and they want to interview you and get your thoughts on this. She said, well, I'm an atheist, I don't have any opinions on this. Like, well, no, that's fine. I don't want your theological opinion. I just want your medical opinion. And so she goes there and she tells them, like, yes, this is a prolonged remission. I can't really explain this. I'm hesitant to call it a miracle, but this isn't normal with leukemia, especially without treatments, right? With stem cell treatment. Nowadays, there are treatments you can get where you could get this to happen, but back in that day in the 70s, there wasn't. So this ended up being qualified, and this person ended up becoming a saint, and they're still alive, I think, to this day, without relapse 40 years later, which is pretty remarkable for leukemia. So this got her interested, and so she basically reviewed the Vatican gave her access to files from the 1500s up until the mid 1900s, and she reviewed all of these and wrote this up in her big book. And she's still an atheist to this day, but she says that she does believe that some of these are genuinely medically inexplicable. And she's like, maybe science will find an answer to that, maybe they won't. But she does take it very seriously. So I think that's a fascinating story to see from that.
Wow, that's fascinating. So just to clarify, uh, you're saying that someone under Catholicism can become a saint if they experience a miracle while they're still alive. Is that right?
No, they don't. Sorry. So the person who
Hmm.
dies is prayed for. There's actually several steps. So say, Logan, that you were a very good Catholic, you were a priest or whatever like that, and you die, right? Your congregation who knew you, right, might venerate you, and they might want you to become
Yeah.
a saint. And in
Right.
Catholic theology, there's purgatory as well as heaven. So saint just means that you're in heaven, because people can be
Right.
purgatory for thousands of years, as long as so as far as we know, right? So
Right. Right.
they don't
Right.
say anyone at this, they don't say that anyone who's not a saint is automatically in heaven. They could still be in purgatory,
Hmm.
so, or hell. But so there are people who say, hey, we want Logan to become a saint, or I guess he'd be Father Jones in this case. So they would first take a look into your life. They would you'd be called a servant of God. That means they're going to open up a review into your life, and they look at every theological thing you've ever written, every action you've done, like interview everyone who knew you, make sure you weren't doing anything that was morally or theologically questionable, that you were a good person, that you were a faithful Catholic, no scandals, anything like that. Once they sign off on that, they have a term called nil obstat, which means nothing stands in the way. It means we don't have an issue. We're not going to say he's a saint, but there's no red flags that we can see, right? So then we have to wait for the miracle to happen. They're saying, okay, there's no theological or moral red flags, but we still don't know. So then someone is allowed to consider you venerable. They're allowed to pray for you privately. So someone is sick, someone in your congregation who knew you or know someone who knew you is like, oh yeah, Father Jones, you should try praying to him. Maybe he'll intercede for you, and say that they pray to you and they get better. Then they would say, oh, okay, did Father Jones heal you from heaven? Then they would look into that. And if they conclude that you did, that's when you would be beatified as a saint. Normally, they required there to be four miracles: two for beatification, which is where you're made a saint locally, and then canonizations where you're made a saint globally, in the terms. But Pope John Paul II in 1983 cut it down to just one each, so it's two miracles now. There's an exception if you're a martyr. If you're a martyr, you only need one, because you died for your faith, so that shows you were. I don't know how that works, but the Pope can just declare you a saint if you died as a martyr. But for most people who are not martyrs, they need to have a few miracles. So
Yeah.
if you're curious for the numbers, this is what they look like. And it's actually the opposite with Lourdes, where they've actually gotten more prevalent over time. About half of all the cases come from the 1900s or later. They're not all just old medieval ones. I think part of that's because documentation's just gotten better and communication's gotten better. So back in the old days, you'd have to ship everything and stuff would get lost. It'd take a lot longer to go through the process. But the
Wow.
Vatican has the Consulta Medica, which is their group of doctors of different specializations,
Mhm.
and they come in and they review it, and it's their job to determine, similar to how Lourdes does it, whether it's a miracle or not. And as you saw with Jacqueline Duffin, they can bring in specialists if they're not sure, where they can get their medical opinion. So they say, hey, can you review this and get back to me on what do you think of this? And then they sort of interview them and question, like it's a panel where they question them, and for
Yeah.
several hours usually, about the details.
Wow. Yeah, and I would just say to my Protestant viewers, I mean, I know I probably have some Catholic viewers who would have take no issue with the idea of miracles as a result of praying to a saint, but for my Protestant viewers, I would say um, a couple of quick thoughts about this. First of all, um, God God knows someone's prayer. Even if they're praying, if they're directing their prayer to a saint, their purpose is ultimately that the prayer reach God. And if you don't believe in praying to saints because you're a Protestant, you can still believe that God knows this person's prayer and their honest plea, and so God can still perform a miracle. Um, and I don't think we should necessarily discount miracles just because they don't fit with our theology. If you expect uh, non-believers, atheists, to be convinced of Christianity because of the evidence from miracles, and you want them to take that evidence seriously, then in the same way, we need to take seriously miracles that occur, even if they don't necessarily fit with our own presuppositions, our own theological viewpoints. So I would just say that just because a prayer occurs, a miracle occurs after a prayer to a saint, does not necessarily mean that the miracle is inauthentic if you're a Protestant.
Very well said, and I definitely agree with that, and I think that's a good way to approach it. And I think whenever we try to discount like other denominations' miracles, it's sort of this is what Hume was doing when he was trying to pit the Protestants against each other. Say, well, look at all these Catholic miracles you all don't believe in. So I think we could just say, well, why not? Like, it seems weird to me to think that God would be like, oh, Sister Martha, I hear your prayers for wanting a cure, but because you have the wrong theology, I just can't do it. I'm sorry. Like, I don't I think that God's more faithful than that. And I think that Catholics are legitimate Christians. I don't agree with them on everything, but I don't think that they're heretics. So
Right.
I absolutely think that God would answer the prayers of a sincere Catholic. I
I
think that
completely
it's
agree. Yeah.
ridiculous to think that he wouldn't. We got two more cases here, both of these with canonization ones. So analogy, right? Biblical. So healings from holy tombs. So it was common to venerate the tombs of holy men back in the day. There was a particular saints like Saint Charbel who were very well known where there's miracles that occur at their tombs. But we see, like, for example, in Second Kings, Elisha is buried, the prophet, and someone, I think a dead body is thrown in the pile, and the body comes back to life when it hits the bones of the prophet. And they ascribe this place as like a holy place where miracles happen. In the same way, it's common in these things for these people to be buried, and people will come to their tombs and they'll be healed. And that sort of adds on to them becoming saints in that way, where people toward it. So, for one example, I think it's interesting is Audrey Toguchi. So, in 1997, I want to say it was, she had noticed a painful lump on her thigh gluteal area, and it was a kind of liposarcoma, which is basically a cancer of the fat, very rare, and it can become pretty dangerous. So her doctor performed surgery. He cut it out of her. He did chemotherapy, and she was relatively good with recovering. About a year after that, though, she got sick again, and when they did the scans, they noticed that this had spread. So this actually came up, and it had spread to her lungs now. And you can see on this photo here on that side, this is the before and after. So she'd had three big lumps on her lungs. And they did a biopsy, and it was the same kind of cancer, liposarcoma. At least they did a biopsy in one of the lumps. So her doctor at that point said, well, this is really bad if it's spread. We can maybe give you chemo to buy you some time, but like realistically, you probably have like 4 months to live. I'm sorry. And obviously she was desperate and out of this. So she goes and she flies to Father Damien's tomb. This was a famous Catholic missionary who was in Hawaii, which is where she lived in. She flew to one of the other islands of Hawaii where his tomb was at. She goes and does a pilgrimage, and she's there for hours praying to Father Damien for his intercession to heal her. Ironically, she comes back 2 or 3 weeks later to do a follow-up, and when her doctor does a follow-up, her scan on the right shows that the tumors are starting to shrink. And her doctor doesn't know how to explain this because this is usually a very aggressive form of cancer. And you can see here the biopsy of it too with the skin cells. And over the course of several months, they keep taking these, and the tumor keeps gradually shrinking until she's better again. And this was so unusual that this was actually published in a medical journal, which is why I included this one. I don't think it's the strongest case per se, but it is a case that was published in not even like a alternative medicine journal, but a mainstream medical journal, the Hawaiian Medical Journal, by her doctor, W.Y. Chang. And her doctor was not a Christian. I think he said he was non-religious. I don't know if that means he's an atheist or just what, but so he wasn't religious, but he was so taken aback by this. And this particular kind of cancer is unique because there are kinds of cancers that can go into remission spontaneously, depends on the kind. Liposarcoma is very rarely ever one that goes into spontaneous remission. From the few cases that I could find where it did, it was never an advanced case. So I think her doctor had said that this, to his knowledge, was the only time where an advanced case of liposarcoma went to spontaneous remission for no reason. Now, could that be coincidence? Possibly, but the fact that her disease was getting worse and spreading, and then literally the exact time when the x-ray showed it getting better was right after she got back from praying to Father Damien's tomb. That could be a coincidence, but given how rare some kind of remission of this sort would be, it seems unlikely to me. And another thing I'll note too is that even though this was published in a medical journal, there was no reference at all to the prayer to Father Damien, to anything like that. It reads just as a standard: patient was seen on this day, had the tumors, patient was seen on this date, tumors began to regress. This is unusual. We don't know why this happened, but it's worth documenting. And that, I think, just adds to the broader conversation about why aren't these published more in medical journals? Well, sometimes they are, but they often usually don't mention the fact, because in a professional medical journal, they'd be like, well, why did you mention her being prayed for? We can't, let's be serious here. We're not going to, frankly, it would be very stigmatized in academia to just attribute this as if the prayers did anything, right? Even if you believe that, to put it in a medical journal as if like you're saying that prayers cause this. So I think that and then I can give you probably 7 or 8 different other examples where this happened, where someone got a very surprising healing that was published in a medical journal because the evidence was good, but the journal didn't mention any of the prayer stuff because
Yeah.
they didn't want to include it.
And
So
and as I mentioned in my video on miracles, then these cases that are these healings that take place after prayer, um, when they're reported in the medical journals without any reference to the religious aspect, then later, if another miracle happens in the context of prayer that is of a similar type, they will point to this
yeah.
spontaneous remission and say, oh, well, this type of cancer is known to occasionally spontaneously remit. So, in essence, they're using one miracle to try to debunk another miracle. So that's one of the kind of the aspects of circular reasoning that are often used to try to argue against these kinds of miracles.
Yeah, and that's a good point. That's why the criteria being unprecedented is kind of hard, because you could have ones where it's like that, where it just was left out. I do remember there was one example where it was published in a sort of alternative medicine journal, where it's about a woman who got healed of Parkinson's disease after being prayed for. And then they did mention that she was prayed for. And they said that when they looked at the literature, they couldn't find any analogous case except for one of the canonization miracles. That was the only example they could find where it was analogous. I'm like, so when they were doing that, like the only case we could find in the literature that was similar to this was one that also happened in religious context. I think that kind of says something about that. But no, you're right. And again, this article, like if you read it, and it's available on PubMed pretty accessibly. The PDF is. They do go over like potential ways in which this could happen and mechanisms, but he ends up saying like, I don't know if any of these are right, and we can't really prove any of these being like this is how it happened. So this is all just highly speculative. So I don't think this is like the strongest case, because you could say we don't know exactly when she got better, like it was because we don't have an X-ray like the second after she prayed or anything like that. But I think the timing of it is still very surprising. And again, given this is we can say at least say highly unlikely to have spontaneously remitted. I think given the other evidence we have cumulatively, it's fair to say this one could have been a miracle, especially since the documentation is so good with all the X-rays there. So the last one I have on here is one of my favorite ones. It is actually one of the newest ones that I found out about. I had mentioned to you earlier that I had a book, this Italian book that I had to track down for forever ago that I got on eBay. It was a whole escapade. But I was looking for this particular cake because I thought it was so interesting. And I'm surprised I've never heard anyone talk about it before. Probably because there's almost no English like material on it. It's all in Italian or Spanish. So in the Gospels, we see a man healed of a withered hand. Whether that means it was paralyzed or like horribly atrophied or missing, it doesn't really clarify, but most depictions are one where it's at least very visibly atrophied. And we've seen people who are born with visibly disabled hands or limbs, right? It's very sad. And these are obviously interesting because typically these don't go away on their own, right? You have to at least have surgery or splinting of some kind. And they're very visibly obvious. So it's hard to be mistaken about someone who has like a severely withered hand, right? Like from cerebral palsy or something like that. So this last Vatican miracle includes a case like that I think is super interesting with lots of documentation. So this is Matthew Pellissieri. That is actually how his name is spelled. It's not a typo because he's from India. So he was born in India with what we would know as clubfoot. I don't know how well you can tell from that picture because he's sitting cross-legged, but basically it's where the leg folds inward and it's kind of in an unnatural way. So he couldn't even walk until he was 5 years old. And even when he did, he was walking on the sides of his legs. He couldn't walk with them straightened. Now, normally you could potentially correct this with surgery or splinting, but they were from a very rural area in India. They couldn't afford medical treatments. And this was back in the 50s. So obviously they had limitations. So he was born with this, and for the first, I think, 14 years of his life had clubfoot, where he had difficulty walking. He was horribly bullied in school, obviously, as being disabled. And at that point, there was no real hope of fixing it on its own. So in 1970, when he's the age of 14, his family gets in contact with this one convent who knew about this nun named Maria Teresa Chiaramella, I think is how you pronounce that. She had died several years back, and they were saying, hey, you all should do a novena, or like you should go on fasting first. So they have this thing where they have a 30-day fast where they say Catholic prayers and are not eating, right? So the whole family does this. And towards the end of this fast, Matthew goes asleep, and he has a dream where he sees Maria talking to him and caressing his leg. And when he wakes up, one of his legs, I think it was his right foot, was completely straightened, right? And so this happens a year later, where they redo this annually for this fast. And after the end of that one too, he wakes up and his other leg is fixed. So you can see from these pictures that there's still obviously atrophy, like his toes are still because it's been like that for 14 years in that way. But they're obviously straightforward now. So he can walk. He's not disabled now. He can put shoes on. He can function like a normal person. He just has a little bit of atrophy in his toes. And you can see the photos of him as an adult, as a teenager. And these are X-rays of his feet as well that they took in that way, which is pretty remarkable. And obviously, this is something that's going to fix on its own. And I think this is another one that's analogous to an amputee healing, because for a crooked leg like that, that's congenital, that you're born with, to instantly straighten, you'd have to have immediate growth of bone, of ligaments, of muscle tissue over just, a few hours at that point if it's overnight. So that's not something that's physically possible without splinting or without surgery. And even with splinting, it would take months, if not years, to gradually put it in place. So there's medical records. There's a statement from his doctor where he confirmed, he actually was the doctor who birthed him back in the 50s. He was like, yes, I confirm he was born with club feet. They talked to other doctors. They had doctors review the x-rays and the photos and say,
The doctor who like helped with the delivery.
yes,
Yeah.
who confirmed that, and he had written in the original records that he was born with clubbed feet.
Wow.
And there was nothing they could do for him because they couldn't afford the treatments. And they also talked to other specialists in this condition and stuff like that, and had them review picture of the x-rays. They had affidavits from everyone who knew him, his teacher, his family, who like confirmed, like, yes, he was certainly had club feet for the first years of his life. And eventually this was confirmed as inexplicable, and Maria Kirmel was canonized as a saint by the Consulta Medica in 2000. So I think that one's particularly interesting. One, because there's lots of photos of the befores and after in the x-rays. And two, it's one of those that's just so visibly obvious that it's really hard for me to think of a good natural explanation for how that could happen if as described.
Wow. So just to clarify, this happened after Maria Caramel was already dead. Is that right?
Correct. As if all of these, correct. So they were praying to her from heaven, correct, to venerate her. So yeah.
And is clubbed feet something that can go into spontaneous resolution over time, or
not when it's that long? If I think over the first, if it gets better within the first few days after birth, the first few weeks, it potentially could. If it's something that you're born with that you've had for like into adolescence, no, it's not going to. That's why usually the treatment would be you'd either need to have it surgically corrected, or it would have to be splinted, like how you have a broken bone and you have to have it in there, and it would eventually splint. You slowly move it, and over time the muscles would adjust, right? But no, when you've had something that's like that atrophied for that long, your whole life, it's not just going to immediately get better. Again, you're basically saying the muscles and ligaments would just have to suddenly grow and switch and change back within a few hours. So no, that's not something that's going to happen overnight. Without any, in fact, there's no way it would happen at all, even gradually, without medical intervention, which there was not in this case.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing those miracles. And I have a couple more questions for you before we wrap up. So now that we've actually seen some compelling miracles that have medical documentation to verify them and that meet a lot of the criteria you talked about, I'm curious, what do you believe that miracles actually prove, especially these types of miracles? Do you think that they just show that the supernatural exists? Do you think that they show that there is a divine being, or do you think they point to Christianity specifically?
Yeah, I think that we can say with I would think with a decent degree of confidence that these are probably caused supernaturally. I'd make the argument for that pretty extensively in the book. I don't think that just appealing to unknown natural causes is going to be very sufficient in most of these cases. You'd have to, in some of these, you'd have to completely rewrite the laws of biology or like of cell growth to like realistically be able to account for them as just unknown natural laws. So I think we can say, given the religious context, we can infer that it was a supernatural being of some kind, right? Now, obviously, we want to be tempted to say, well, it's the Christian God because they're Christian prayers. But as you pointed out earlier, if you think that we can say, well, the Virgin Mary may not have healed you at Lourdes, or well, maybe Father Damien didn't heal you in that, but God did. That does get a little bit trickier with how we do that, because it goes both ways. The Pentecostals also have they're examples, right? So it's not only with one denomination. So I
Mhm.
think it's difficult to say the specific theology behind it. But I will say I do think that these are an argument for Christianity specifically and not just supernaturalism. And the reason I would say that is because I think the miracles go in one direction towards Christianity. Yes, there are other religions that have miracle claims. That's no one disputes that. But I would say the one, I think the Christian miracles are just better documented, and I think we've gone over that here. You really don't have anything analogous, so far as I know, to other religions like Lourdes or the Vatican, where they have like a whole panel of people who reviews these and documents these. Part of that's because there's in third world countries where Hinduism is popular or Islam, the documentation in general just isn't going to be as good. But again, if God wants to convey that Islam or whatever is true through miracles, he can surely he could get around that. So I think that the evidence is just better for the Christian side, and I think the Christians have an advantage to say that miracles are evangelistic in their worldview. Most religions, when they have miracles, especially like Hinduism or the Eastern religions, they already happen within the religion itself, where followers of a guru will say that they see miracles, but they're Hindus passing on other Hindu miracles or Muslims passing on other miracles. You don't see sort of the conversion aspect. But Keener does a great job in his book of showing how Pentecostalism is growing hugely because people are converting to it from these other religions, especially in the third world, because of that. So it seems like, yes, God could do a miracle just because he wants to heal someone, or he wants to restore someone's personal faith. But I think a God who does miracles, or at least miracles that occur in a context where it specifically converts someone who otherwise isn't, that to me seems very unlikely under like a pluralist model. That seems more consistent with Christian exclusivism, because if it's the God of Islam or the deist God who doesn't care what religion you are, why is he converting people through miracles to Christianity? So for me, I only see that going in one direction. And I think the fact that Christianity is so widespread, Islam is as well, granted, but I wouldn't think that God would do a miracle just sort of as a one-off, like to a tribe in Africa, for example, and like no one ever's ever heard of this, and that's that. All these miracles, you may not have heard of them specifically, but they occur within the context of the greater miracle of the resurrection and of Christianity. So I think these miracles further the Christian cause, whereas most miracle claims are just one-offs that don't happen within the context of a greater message that converts people. That seems unlikely to me that a God would want to bother doing that. So I would expect that if there was a God who wants us to know a message, he would do it in a way where it would bolster this way, like globally and culturally influenced. And that's what you see in Christianity, the biggest
Yeah.
religion in the world.
Yeah. So I'm curious, how do you think that the argument for Christianity or for God from miracles compares to other apologetics arguments, like, for example, the argument from the resurrection of Jesus, or, arguments for God from cosmology, like the fine tuning argument or the Kalam cosmological argument? Do you think that there are any advantages to that over the other apologetics arguments?
I do, and I think it's funny you bring that up because if you read the philosophical literature, like just go on Phil papers and you look at the number of papers that have been produced on the arguments from God, argument from miracles is dead last, or like it's either dead last or towards the dead land. There's more articles on the ontological argument and on Pascal's wager than there are on miracles, which is crazy to me. And most of those articles on miracles are just about Hume and like epistemology. So
Yeah.
the actual amount of people who've been publishing on specific cases is very low, which is why I wanted to try to contribute to some of that literature,
Yeah.
because it just hasn't been discussed that much outside of people like Keener, and even then, not to like the extent that I think we'd like to see it, as much of a trailblazer as he is. So I think that the argument for miracles is very underrated for that reason, and I think that one advantage it has is that it's actually meant to be an argument for God's existence. And when I say that, I mean to say that the fine-tuning argument, you could say if God fine-tuned the universe, surely that's not the reason he did it, so that's evidence for its existence. It's meant to be to create us, to create life, or like the cosmological argument. He created the universe for other purposes, and we can happen to use that as evidence for his existence, but that wasn't the main purpose behind it, right? As if that was what it was. But with miracles, by definition, they actually are meant to be evidence for God's existence. They're messages. They're things being conveyed theologically. So it's kind of funny to me that people are using like indirect evidence for God's existence through these other arguments, but miracles are meant to be direct empirical evidence, and that is, I think, underutilized. So yeah, I certainly think it's an underrated argument, and for me, it's my personal favorite because I've looked into it the most, and I can attest, anecdotally. Uh, I do know of people who are agnostics or like general theists or whatever who have privately told me that like they were super excited about it coming out, first of all, the book, and secondly, that this really compelled them, that they don't really know how to address it, and that it's actually moving them towards theism. And not only that, but they've also said that like they are, not only do they acknowledge that, but they're almost embarrassed to acknowledge that to the other people in their community because they'll be written off. It's like, oh, you can't be
Yeah.
serious, right? It's like, oh, you're talking about ghost stories or whatever. So it's kind of, I think it is stigmatized, but it's one of those where people will like privately tell me like this is actually really compelling, but they don't want to come out and say that because they're worried about being seen as like, there's like the high level philosophical arguments about that philosophers' religions will use, and then you have, oh, someone had a club foot that was instantly healed in India. Yeah, right. Despite what
Yeah.
the evidence is. So I think it's underrated. I think people are partially worried about using it for that because they'll believe that they'll just be gullible. Um,
Yeah.
but I think it's evidentially sound.
Wow. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. So when exactly do you think your book is going to come out?
My goal right now is to have it out before Christmas. I can't promise that. That's what I'm hoping. But most of it's basically done being written. I'm just concising it, stripping stuff down, making it shorter and stuff like that. It's probably going to be close to 400 pages or more. I don't know. It's a lot. And then I hope to have a second volume at some point in the near future on specifically about amputee healing. So limbs growing back, body parts growing back, bone, intestines,
Wow.
kidneys, stuff like that. And so
Wow.
far as I know, no one else has done a book, anything like that on that issue. So I think it'll be one of the first on there. So I'm hoping that it makes a splash and that it starts conversations. And that's all I
Yeah.
ask. I don't expect people to be immediately converted or persuaded by this because it's a tough topic. But I do at least hope that people will look at this and say, you know what, I didn't take this seriously before, but now I think it's worth addressing. And I hope that more people engage with this argument, whether or not they agree with it. That's all I ask, in that way, to say that it's worth looking into. And I'll also just say, as a point of, I guess more of a pastoral point, like I also am sympathetic to people who hear these and yet are themselves not healed. I don't think that God's goal is to heal everyone. And so I don't think that people aren't healed because they don't have enough faith. I mean, that might be true for some people, but I don't try to victim blame. I think God has a will and that he chooses to heal some people for some reasons and some for other reasons, but I don't think they should be blamed for that. So I don't mean to have these stories to rub it in anyone's face who are
Right.
really sick. But I
Yeah.
think
I mean,
it is some optimism though to say that that's possible and that we should continue to hold out faith, because some of these examples, people were sick for years before they got healed. And I've never come across a case once where someone was ungrateful, where they were healed and they said, but God, I wish you would have healed me 5 years earlier. Like they were
yeah.
always like, it was the best thing that ever happened to me and I would go through it again. It was
Mhm.
spiritually invigorating. So that's what I hope that heaven's like. And I think miracles are glimpses through the curtain, the man on the other
Yeah.
side of the curtain, to see what heaven's gonna be like when there are no diseases.
Wow. Fascinating. Well, thank you so much for sharing. And I'll look forward to your book coming out, and I'm sure I'll be talking about it more on my channel. So thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks, Logan.